But it shall come to pass, if thou wilt not hearken unto the voice of the Lord thy God, to observe to do all his commandments and his statutes, which I command thee this day, that all these curses shall come upon thee, and overtake thee. Cursed shalt thou be in the city, and cursed shalt thou be in the field. Cursed shall be thy basket and thy store. Cursed shall be the fruit of thy body, and the fruit of thy land, the increase of thy kine, and the flocks of thy sheep. Cursed shalt thou be when thou comest in, and cursed shalt thou be when thou goest out. The Lord shall send upon thee cursing, vexation, and rebuke, in all that thou settest thine hand unto for to do, until thou be destroyed, and until thou perish quickly, because of the wickedness of thy doings, whereby thou hast forsaken me. The Lord shall make the pestilence cleave unto thee, until he have consumed thee from off the land whither thou goest to possess it. The Lord shall smite thee with a consumption, and with a fever, and with an inflammation, and with an extreme burning, and with a sword, and with blasting, and with mildew, and they shall pursue thee until thou perish. And thy heaven that is over thy head shall be brass, and the earth that is under thee shall be iron. The Lord shall make the rain of thy land powder and dust. From heaven shall it come down upon thee, until thou be destroyed. The Lord shall cause thee to be smitten before thine enemies. Thou shalt go out one way against them, and flee 7 ways before them, and shalt be removed into all the kingdoms of the earth. And thy carcass shall be meat unto all fowls of the air, and unto the beasts of the earth, and no man shall fray them away. The Lord will smite thee with the botch of Egypt, and with the emerods, and with the scab, and with the itch, whereof thou canst not be healed. The Lord shall smite thee with madness, and blindness, and astonishment of heart. And thou shalt grope at noonday, as the blind gropeth in darkness. And thou shalt not prosper in thy ways, and thou shalt be only oppressed and spoiled evermore, and no man shall save thee. Thou shalt betroth a wife, and another man shall lie with her. Thou shalt build an house, and thou shalt not dwell therein. Thou shalt plant a vineyard, and shalt not gather the grapes thereof. Thine ox shall be slain before thine eyes, and thou shalt not eat thereof. Thine ass shall be violently taken away from before thy face, and shall not be restored to thee. Thy sheep shall be given unto thine enemies, and thou shalt have none to rescue them. Thy sons and thy daughters shall be given unto another people, and thine eyes shall look, and fail with longing for them all the day long, and there shall be no might in thine hand. The fruit of thy land and all thy labors shall a nation which thou knowest not eat up, and thou shalt be only oppressed and crushed always, so that thou shalt be mad for the sight of thine eyes, which thou shalt see. The Lord shall smite thee in the knees, and in the legs, with a sore botch that cannot be healed, from the sole of thy foot unto the top of thy head. The Lord shall bring thee, and thy king which thou shalt set over thee, unto a nation which neither thou nor thy fathers have known. And there shalt thou serve other gods, wood and stone. And thou shalt become an astonishment, a proverb, and a byword among all nations whither the Lord shall lead thee. Thou shalt carry much seed out into the field, and shalt gather but little in, for the locust shall consume it. Thou shalt plant vineyards and dress them, but shalt neither drink of the wine, nor gather the grapes, for the worms shall eat them. Thou shalt have olive trees throughout all thy coasts, but thou shalt not anoint thyself with the oil, for thine olive shall cast his fruit. Thou shalt beget sons and daughters, but thou shalt not enjoy them, for they shall go into captivity. All thy trees and fruit of thy land shall the locust consume. The stranger that is within thee shall get up above thee very high, and thou shalt come down very low. He shall lend to thee, and thou shalt not lend to him. He shall be the head, and thou shalt be the tail. Moreover, all these curses shall come upon thee, and shall pursue thee, and overtake thee, till thou be destroyed, because thou hearkenest not unto the voice of the Lord thy God, to keep his commandments and his statutes, which he commanded thee. And they shall be upon thee for a sign, and for a wonder, and upon thy seed forever, because thou servest not the Lord thy God with joyfulness, and with gladness of heart, for the abundance of all things. Therefore shalt thou serve thine enemies which the Lord shall send against thee, in hunger, and in thirst, and in nakedness, and in want of all things. And he shall put a yoke of iron upon thy neck, until he have destroyed thee. The Lord shall bring a nation against thee from far, from the end of the earth, as swift as the eagle flieth, a nation whose tongue thou shalt not understand, a nation of fierce countenance, which shall not regard the person of the old, nor show favor to the young. And he shall eat the fruit of thy cattle, and the fruit of thy land, until thou be destroyed, which also shall not leave thee either corn, wine, or oil, or the increase of thy kine, or flocks of thy sheep, until he have destroyed thee. And he shall besiege thee in all thy gates, until thy high and fenced walls come down, wherein thou trustest, throughout all thy land. And he shall besiege thee in all thy gates throughout all thy land, which the Lord thy God hath given thee. And thou shalt eat the fruit of thine own body, the flesh of thy sons and of thy daughters, which the Lord thy God hath given thee, in the siege, and in the straitness wherewith thine enemies shall distress thee. So that the man that is tender among you, and very delicate, his eyes shall be evil toward his brother, and toward the wife of his bosom, and toward the remnant of his children which he shall leave, so that he will not give to any of them of the flesh of his children whom he shall eat, because he hath nothing left him in the siege, and in the straitness, wherewith thine enemies shall distress thee in all thy gates. The tender and delicate woman among you, which would not adventure to set the sole of her foot upon the ground for delicateness and tenderness, her eye shall be evil toward the husband of her bosom, and toward her son, and toward her daughter, and toward her young one that cometh out from between her feet, and toward her children which she shall bear. For she shall eat them for want of all things secretly in the siege and straitness, wherewith thine enemies shall distress thee in thy gates. If thou wilt not observe to do all the words of this law that are written in this book, that thou mayest fear this glorious and fearful name, the Lord thy God, then the Lord will make thy plagues wonderful, and the plagues of thy seed, even great plagues, and of long continuance, and sore sicknesses, and of long continuance. Moreover, he will bring upon thee all the diseases of Egypt, which thou wast afraid of, and they shall cleave unto thee. Also every sickness and every plague, which is not written in the book of this law, them will the Lord bring upon thee, until thou be destroyed. And ye shall be left few in number, whereas ye were as the stars of heaven for multitude, because thou wouldest not obey the voice of the Lord thy God. And it shall come to pass, that as the Lord rejoiced over you to do you good, and to multiply you, so the Lord will rejoice over you to destroy you, and to bring you to naught. And ye shall be plucked from off the land whither thou goest to possess it. And the Lord shall scatter thee among all people, from the one end of the earth even unto the other. And there thou shalt serve other gods, which neither thou nor thy fathers have known, even wood and stone. And among these nations shalt thou find no ease, neither shall the sole of thy foot have rest. But the Lord shall give thee there a trembling heart, and failing of eyes, and sorrow of mind. And thy life shall hang in doubt before thee, and thou shalt fear day and night, and shalt have none assurance of thy life. In the morning thou shalt say, Would God it were even, and at even thou shalt say, Would God it were morning, for the fear of thine heart wherewith thou shalt fear, and for the sight of thine eyes which thou shalt see. And the Lord shall bring thee into Egypt again with ships, by the way whereof I spake unto thee. Thou shalt see it no more again. And there ye shall be sold unto your enemies for bondmen and bondwomen, and no man shall.
Wheel about and turn about and do just so. Every time I wheel about, I jump Jim Crow. Wheel about and turn about and do just so. Every time I wheel about, I jump Jim Crow. Wheel about and turn about and do just so. Every time I wheel about, I jump Jim Crow. Wheel about and turn about and do just so.
Ever since this world of ours began, man's been killing off his fellow man. Yeah. Cursing is wearing and threatening the other side as he waves flags and simply leads to all mankind.
Indian slavery in colonial times within the present limits of the United States. Indian slavery by Almond Wheeler Lauber, PhD. And chapter 2 is enslavement by the Spaniards. And it begins in their attitude toward the Indians. The Spaniards simply applied the theory of their time regarding slavery. The taking of slaves was then considered part of any expedition of discovery or conquest. So it was a normal thing for the Spaniards to do. It was part of what they did when they so-called discovered something, right? Or when they went into conquest. The high authority of the church sanctioned the institution of slavery to the extent that the leading theologians had declared all barbarous and infidel nations who shut their ears to the truths of Christianity fair objects of rapine, captivity, and slavery. Again, so this is from the high authority of the church, which meant the Vatican. The papal bull they're talking about. If you didn't accept Christ or Jesus, you were a pagan, all right, or an infidel. You were declared a barbarous infidel if you didn't want to hear the truths of Christianity. All right, so because of that, you were open to be put in captivity and slavery. All right, remember, this is a very scholarly article telling you how it really went down. Here, Columbus was the major supplier of American slaves prior to 1500. As noted earlier, he caused some 3,000 to perhaps 6,000 slaves to be sent to Europe, and also, if we are to believe that his plans were implemented to the Azores, Canary, Madeira, and Cabo Verde Islands. By the year 1500, however, a great escalation began in the shipment of Americans across the Atlantic, since other Spaniards and the Portuguese became directly active. In the year 1500, Americans were directly transported to Europe from the Caribbean islands, from the coast of South America, and from the Terra Nova, Newfoundland region, that's up there in Canada. 3 major new sources of slaves were thus opened up, and it is necessary to examine this subject before proceeding to an analysis of what happened to the Americans when they arrived in eastern lands. So right from the beginning, the plan was to enslave the ancestors. They were bringing them to all their colonies, wherever that was in the world, especially over to Europe, as it says here. This is way before the so-called transatlantic slave trade. Or did we just skip all this part of history? Street peasants. So the people he brought here were wild. They didn't give a damn what they were doing. You know, they didn't care. They didn't think twice. They came here and saw riches, women, paradise. All right, that was strategic. Columbus knew what he was doing. He was coming to enslave you, enslave the ancestors. You were gold to him. The general feeling regarding the relation of the Indians to the Spaniards is well expressed by Hernando de Escalante Fontanero, who was with Menendez in Florida as an interpreter. In writing of Florida, he declared it his belief that the Indians can never be made submissive and become Christians. So he advocated that they all be taken, placed on ships, and scattered throughout the various islands and even on the Spanish Main, where they might be sold as His Majesty sells his vessels to the grandees in Spain. You heard that, right? So he's saying, since they're so hard to enslave, and they're never going to be Christians. They're not, you know, they're rebels. They don't want to be, following Christianity. They don't want to be worked. They don't want to be, put in fields or become servants. So let's just enslave them. He's basically telling you, send them to their different colonies, put them in ships, Deuteronomy 28, place on ships, scattered throughout the various islands, and even on the Spanish Main. What does that mean? The New Spain and even Europe. I've sent men to a house on the west bank of the river. They have brought me back 7 head of women, girls and adults, and 3 infants. You see, they were just going to the village and kidnapping and enslaving babies, women, little girls, older women. All right? To be an Indian and a woman to boot immediately puts you on the same level as cattle. The Indian slaves with that. He's saying the 8th plague was the slaves, whom the Spaniards made in order to put them to work in the mines. At first, those who were already slaves of the Aztecs were taken, then those who had given evidence of insubordination, finally all those who could be caught. During the first years after the conquest, the slave traffic flourished. Again, during the first years after the conquest, not discovery, conquest, the slave traffic flourished. Papal bull. Grab all these pagans, these enemies of Christ, and make them perpetual servants. They made it a law, an edict, a papal bull. You have to follow it. They had permission, they had the laws, everything backing them up. Again, during the first years of their conquest, the slave traffic flourished, and slaves often changed master. They produced so many marks on their faces, in addition to the royal brand, that they had their faces covered with letters. Man, so many letters looked like they had tattoos. So many, they was tattooed up, but they was burnt, right? Branded with letters in their face. For they bore the marks of all who had bought and sold them. Bought and sold them. Vasco de Quiroga, in a letter to the Council of the Indies, has also left a description of these faces transformed into illegible books, like the victims' bodies in Kafka's penal colony. They are marked with brands on the face, and in their flesh are imprinted the initials of the names of those who are successively their owners. They pass from hand to hand, and some have 3 or 4 names, so that the faces of these men, who were created in God's image, have been, by our sins, transformed into paper. Their faces became paper. They were just branding them all over the place, and their faces
is creating a very strong stench up and down the coast. Our tennis reporter Rachel Bianco has a look at what scientists are calling the strongest red tide in decades.
People here at Fletcher Cove happy to be able to use the beach again, but many of them told us they couldn't help but notice the smell.
It looks like a picture-perfect beach day, but what you can't see is the odor.
I more noticed it last week when I was driving on the freeway through here and through the lagoon area, but yeah, it is kind of stinky.
That smell reported up and down the coast.
Kind of almost like sulfurish, like sewage.
This one is widespread from Baja California up into the Los Angeles region. So this is a major event.
Dr. Michael Latz is a marine biologist at Scripps Institution of Oceanography. He says this is the strongest red tide in 25 years.
And as you probably noticed, the water is pretty brown out there. That's because there's a very large accumulation of these microorganisms.
What turns the waves a reddish brown during the day transforms them into an impressive blue light show at night.
So when a predator grabs them, that creates a force that they react to. It's like a reflex. And that flash of light that they produce acts to startle the predator.
As the red tide breaks down, oxygen is reduced. Fish die, especially near lagoons and harbors, something these sisters noticed on their weekend bike ride.
And then we just smell this disgusting smell. I'm like, what is that? So I look in the water and I see a bunch of dead fish lying around.
I think people should appreciate these as manifestations of nature.
Rachel Bianco, 10 News.
All right, there's no way to know how long the red tide will last, but the best time to try to catch that bioluminescent display is at least 2 hours after sunset.
The California Gulf was also called the Red Sea originally in the 1500s, and this title still applies today, hence its present name, Vermilion Sea. Vermilion is one of the brightest shades of red, and on the other hand, the modern Red Sea never got its name until the 1800s. Before this, it was called Sinus Arabicus, or the Gulf of Arabia.
Compostela in the company of, among others, 6 Christians and what? 500 Indian slaves. 500 Indian slaves. All right, are you starting to add up the numbers? A History of Slavery in Virginia by James Curtis Balla, Associate in History at Johns Hopkins University. All right, 1902. And it says here, for institutional beginnings of the system of American Negro slavery, we are to look then to the Bermudas and to Barbados, rather than to Virginia, Massachusetts, or New York. How far the rules regulating the relation of master and slave in the Spanish colonies influenced the custom and legislation of the English is difficult to determine. The contrast in the two resultant slave systems, if it be a safe guide, suggests that if any influence existed between them, it was extremely meager. Some connection, however, is shown between the system of the island and mainland colonies of England, particularly in the influence of Bermudas upon South Carolina. The introduction of the Negro as a profitable labor supply in the English as in the Spanish colonies was the result of a deliberate commercial design. A London mercantile company, the Company for the Somers Islands. All right, there we go. The Company for the Somers Islands sent in 1616 one of its trading ships to the West Indies for products. All right, so they had a ship. And this is, now pay attention, right? This is important, 1616, because these are supposed to be the first so-called African slave that was brought to the Americas or used in 1616, right? So it says that they had this company, the Somers Islands, which King James was involved in, all right, had basically some trading ships that they sent to the West Indies, right? Not Africa, right? They sent to the West Indies. We're gonna read somewhere else. Oh, we know already that it's in Venezuela. They sent. All right, they went to Venezuela, South America. All right, so again, from 1660, one of its trading ships to the West Indies for products, right, such as sugarcane, which they hoped to introduce into Bermudas, and for Negroes to divide for pearls. They went to go look for Negroes in Venezuela in 1616. Of America, the first Negro, together with a single Indian and West Indian products. The first Negro, you hear that? So-called Negro. They're just talking about American Indians. Were to be brought back late in the summer of that year. So they went to South America, Venezuela, grabbed some Negroes to die for pearls, and they came back. They called one of them Negro and the other one Indian. And they went back to Bermuda. The relation of the Negro to the profitable cultivation of sugar cane was soon discovered and fresh importations were made. All right, so we're going to take a look at this article I found online. It's actually called Before the Acadiba, the African Colonization of Bermuda, 1616, 1680s, Batosh the Hijack, all right? It says, but it was, however, another captain, George Bargrave of the Edwin, who would make history when he left Bermuda in June 1616. He returned in August of that year. So he left Bermuda, right? He left Bermuda. He returned in August of that year with a variety of tropical items, sugarcane, figs, plantains, pineapples, and lignum vitae. But he also returned with one Indian and a Negro. Is this one Indian also a Negro? Huh? And who's this Negro? Where does it say he's African? Where in this record does it say he was from Africa? You understand what I'm trying to say and show you? That they've been telling us all our lives that the first so-called African that was put into plantation or slavery or whatever in America was in Bermuda in 1616. Is this account that I'm reading to you guys now? And this is, as far as the trail goes, you're going to see there is no history of this so-called Negro other than this account. How does he lead, or how is he African? So why are they saying he's African the rest of the time? Unless you go to the original records where it just says a Negro and one Indian. All right, so he left from Bermuda, right? And ended up in South America and Venezuela. That's where he got these they call it the West Indies, but that's where he got these. people. All right, and he went back and brought them to Bermuda, 1616. The latter of which a later governor, Nathaniel Butler, declared was the first these lands ever had. So the first they had. All right, so that's the reference. If Bargrave had carried out what Tucker's commission had commanded of Wilmot, as his other items seem to suggest he had, these two individuals were probably pearl divers, and thus, given the journey of about 2 months, probably originated from the nearest pearling stations in the Americas, the La Margarita, La Cumana operations off the coast of Venezuela. That's where they were coming from, near the Orinoco and Amazon, where we have numerous records, historic accounts of black tribes, so-called black, dark-skinned tribes in this area. All right. So this Negro most likely was American Indian. You got to prove to me this is an African. All right. So my whole point of this is to show you that you got to really research things and get to the bottom of it. All right. So again, they came from Venezuela, not from Africa. You can find this in Bermuda under the Summer Islands Company, Volume 1, 2005. Also, I wanted to mention that we will be discussing who was really being used for diving for pearls today, which were American indigenous people who we're going to see, who had the expertise since ancient times, all right? They were the ones doing it since ancient times. Now, again, if you Google, Bermuda's first slaves or anything like that, you're going to get something like this. It says in the 17th century, right? 1616, first non-Anglos arrived. In 1616, the first so-called black man and a Carib Indian, all right? Carib Indian and a so-called black man were brought to Bermuda on the ship Edwin to dive for pearls. To dive for pearls. We're going to see today, we're going to read from a book of the history of the pearl, right? A very scholarly book. And we're going to see who was really diving and who was the experts, who were the so-called Spanish or British or so-called Dutch. Remember, these are Sephardic Jews, mostly Moorish, crypto Jews or crypto Muslims, who are the captains of these ships, who was all doing all this stuff, colonizing and again, these are indentured servants, a so-called black man and a Carib Indian to dive for pearls. We've actually going to see, there's no history of any so-called person that actually was born in Africa, that ended up in Venezuela, that actually was brought to Bermuda. That's a whole lot of conjecture, and black is a crayon color. All right, so let's start the hijack. So it says here, the Book of the Pearl, The History, Art, Science, and Industry of the Queen of Gems by George Frederick Kuntz, PhD, Charles Hugh Stevenson, LMM, whatever that means. So New York, this is written in 1908, all right, the Book of the Pearl. All right, so we're in chapter 10 of this book, and it says here, Pearl Fisheries of Venezuela. When I discovered the Indies, I said that they composed the richest country in the world, all right? When I discovered the Indies, the richest country in the world, I spake of gold and pearls and precious stones, and the traffic that might be carried on it in them. Extract from Columbus, 4th letter. The Caribbean Sea furnishes one of the most interesting chapters in the history of the pearl fisheries. In no region of the world have these resources caused more rapid exploitation or affected the inhabitants to a greater extent than on the shores of Venezuela. All right, we're talking about the same place where they went and got the so-called Indian and Negro, right? In 1616. All right, so it affected the inhabitants. Who's the inhabitants? We're talking about the aboriginals. They're the indigenous people of that place. Before the discovery of America, the natives, again, the natives, not Africans, of this region collected pearls. All right, the natives of this region collected pearls from the mollusks, which they opened for food in times of necessity, and also sought them for ornamental purposes. And although they had large collections which they used for personal ornamentation and for decorating their temples, it does not appear that they prized them extravagantly, readily bartering from them for small returns. In Columbus' account of his third and fourth voyages to America, he repeatedly refers to pearls. On the third voyage in 1498, after passing the mouth of the Orinoco River, he entered the Gulf of Paria, where the natives came to the ship in their canoes in countless numbers, many of them wearing pieces of gold on their breast, and some with bracelets of pearls on their arms. Seeing this, I was much delighted and made many inquiries with the view of learning where they found them. They replied that they were to be procured in their own neighborhood, and also at a spot to the northward of that place. Continuing the book, it says, this expedition of Pedro Alonso Niño was the first financially profitable voyage to America. And I think we got him in our Columbus and his Negro friends videos. He was actually a dark-skinned European. This is a so-called Negro European. This is Pedro Alonso Niño. All right, so it says that he was the first financially profitable voyage to America. After his return, the Cubagua pearl fishery in Venezuela became the object of numerous speculations, and many other Spaniards fitted out voyages, most of them sailing from Hispaniola or Haiti, 900 miles distant. Owing to the ill treatment of the Indians and excessive cruelties towards them, much difficulty was experienced in securing divers. This was relieved in 1508, listen to this, by transporting large numbers of Indians from Lucayan or Bahama Islands and impressing them into the service. So how did they get their pearl divers? They got them from the Lucayan or the Bahama Islands, all right? So where does it say these were Africans? All right, so you see where if there was any so-called Negro or anybody being worked there as, divers, it was either the local American Indians that were there doing it for hundreds and thousands of years, or because of how they were treating them, they didn't want to be enslaved or do any more favors for or trade, with the Spanish or Portuguese. They had to go get other Indians from the Lucayan and Bahama Island, not Africans, other Indians. All right, so this so-called Negro and American Indian that they went and got from Venezuela that were expert pearl divers, all right, and they brought back to Bermuda, all right. How can we prove that's an African when there's more correlation to show that these are most likely with logic, all right? You can see that these are more likely American Indians, all right? Continuing, it says, these were so expert, we're talking about the Lucayan or Bahama Island people or Indians. These were so expert in the work, we're talking about pearl.
I want you to ask these questions. Was Jackson right? Andrew Jackson, Manifest Destiny, the beginning of that. Was he right that the Native Americans were savages? Or was Jefferson right that there was something going on here that we don't even understand? Maybe they were descendants of Egyptians or Jews, or maybe they were from Asia. Where were these people from? But they weren't savages.
Reading from the Archives of Aboriginal Knowledge, containing all the original papers laid before Congress. All right, before Congress, respecting the history, antiquities, language, ethnology, pictography, rites, superstitions, and mythology of the Indian tribes of the United States by Henry R. Schoolcraft, LL.D., with illustrations in 6 volumes. This is volume 1. And it says here, in regard to the manners, customs, habits of the wild tribes of the Western Territory, a true and more correct type than any I have ever seen may be found in the ancient history of the Jews or Israelites after their liberation from Egyptian bondage. The medicine lodge of the Indian may be compared to the place of worship or tabernacle of the Jews, and the sacrifices, offerings, purifications, ablutions, and anointings may be all found amongst and practiced by those people. The customs of Indian women at certain periods and after childbearing are almost those of the Jewish women. They have to undergo a probation of a certain number of days on all such occasions, besides ablutions and purifications, before they are considered fit to enter on their domestic duties. During this probation they are considered unclean and altogether unfit to enter the lodge or join with the family, which indeed they never attempt, but erect a hut for themselves when they remain the whole time, having their food brought to them. The manner of mourning for a deceased relative is very similar to that of the Israelites. In such cases, the men will cast. From the book Israelite and Indian, A Parallel in Planes of Culture. Address of Garrick Mallory, Vice President, Section H of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Toronto meeting, August 1889. Alright, this is an address from Garrick Mallory, Vice President of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Gary says, many authors have contended that the North American Indians were descendants of the 10 lost tribes of Israel. Prominent among them was James Adair, whose work highly useful with regard to the customs of the southeastern Indians, among whom he spent many years, was mainly devoted to proof of the proposition. So we do have a book from James Adair, and we're going to go into it later. The Reverend Ethan Smith is also conspicuous, and even the last book discussing the Indians published last year, bearing the comprehensive title The American Indian, favors the same theory. The authors of the school mentioned have for their excuse the fact, which I freely admit with greater emphasis, that an outstanding number of customs of the North American Indians are the same as those recorded of the ancient Hebrews, but the lesson to be derived from the parallel between the Indians and the Israelites is very different from that of a descent advocated.
Let me show you one more connection. In 1860, David Wyrick, he's a guy who surveyed the Newark earthworks. He was digging into a mound near those earthworks, and he found a wooden coffin made of oak. They opened up the coffin and found a skeleton of a man holding a little box. It was about 8.10 inches in size. The box had been cemented shut here. This, by the way, is sitting in Ohio. Well, he opened up the box and he found a little man inside, a little black stone. They took it to scholars and they looked at it. The man seems to be carrying something, and there's writing here at first they couldn't recognize. The writing is, they thought in 1860, some sort of Hebrew. Well, finally, about 20 years later, they found some rabbis living in the area, and the rabbis looked at that, and they could read it. They said it was an old kind of block Hebrew, and it was a rendition of the 10 Commandments. Now, this is another piece. Block Hebrew, they said they'd never seen anything like it. Mainstream archaeologists at the time called this a hoax. But then in 1900, or just about after 1900, in Israel, they found the same block-style Hebrew writing. Mainstream archaeologists still dismissed the findings. They found it in Israel, and they found it in Ohio. But there was another stone that they found that they couldn't argue. This is the Bat Creek stone. It was found during the course of an official Smithsonian evacuation. The Smithsonian didn't understand the meaning of the writing on the stone. They thought it was Cherokee, since it came from Cherokee country. They didn't realize that it's actually Hebrew. They had published this originally upside down. They threw it in a box at the bottom of the Smithsonian, put it in the basement. Many years later, a scholar took it out of the box, looked at it, and went, oh my gosh, it's upside down. It's Phoenician, ancient Hebrew. So what's going on here? What is that about? Where is that history? I'll show you in a few minutes, and we're going to have a conversation, and I'm going to show you some more things that the Smithsonian, science, government, commerce colluded to erase.
Hey, so shout out to Glenn Beck. He said that before he got fired from Fox, and whatever his reasons, hey, it helps, man. It's all part of the wave, right? We're surfing. It's all part of Hawa, increasing the knowledge, right? Daniel 12:4. William Penn gave the clue to many subsequent biblical scholars in declaring that he had found in the American Indians the lost tribes of Israel. The superficial resemblance between the two peoples was so striking that he was led to say, when I look at their children, I imagine myself in the Jewish quarter of London. The Reverend J. Wesley Ina says in Science Herald in Boston that as late as 1889, a well-informed representative of the Moshkoki tribe, Moshkoki or Moshkoki Moscow, when questioned concerning the legends of his people, replied, they are all in the Old Testament. Read them there without the trouble of taking them down from our people. Corroborative of this is the statement of Dr. W. W. Warren in his History of the Ojibwe Nation, that in response to the parts of the Bible which he translated for this people, they said, "The book must be true, for our ancestors have told us the same stories for generations." It's called Atlantis, the Antediluvian World by Ignatius' book. It's called The Ancient Mystic Oriental Masonry. Its teachings, rules, laws, present usages which govern the order of the present day. Alright, so in this book, just wanted to show a couple of things here to correlate what we've been learning about the true old world. It says, we are not indebted to either ancient Egypt for either religion or masonry, but to America. So he's saying how they believe that all these symbolism came out of Egypt, and that from there it was spread to those other places like India and Persia. But it says, we are not indebted to either ancient Egypt for either religion or masonry, but to America. It is a fact that at Memphis, Egypt, in the pyramids, under the guidance of the kings of the mystic rites of masonry, were worked many thousands of years ago. But at that time, Egypt and the continent of America were one and the same. Alright, so when they're talking about Memphis, Egypt, what Memphis are they talking about? Are they talking about Memphis in America? The real Egypt? We're about to read that right now. So listen to what they're saying. It says, in America, rediscovered in the 15th century and repopulated in the 17th, was recovered Egypt and the promised land. Alright? Egypt and the promised land. The promised land, right? The ancient Hebrews. Or the land of the constellation of the eagle.
As I go through the research, I find certain things ringing bells with me. I'm working in the Mississippi Valley. I'm at Moundville in Alabama, and I'm looking at a notice board. It's just the beginning of my research into this interesting culture in the Mississippi Valley. And the notice board has been put up by the site, and they're telling us about the site. And what they say is that the whole site was about afterlife beliefs. And that it was believed that on death, the soul of the deceased would ascend to the constellation of Orion, and then would pass through the constellation of Orion to the Milky Way, and then would make a journey along the Milky Way where it would face trials and tribulations and be judged on its behavior during life. The weird thing is, that's exactly the ancient Egyptian system of religion. It's exactly the system. It's too detailed to be a coincidence. What is that narrow star shaft in the Great Pyramid doing, if not pointing at the lowest of the 3 stars of Orion's belt, to send the soul of the deceased up to Orion, then indeed a journey along the Milky Way, trials and tribulations, and a judgment. The same story exactly. But how do we explain that? Can it be a coincidence? No, I don't think so. Details are far too complicated.
Called Atlantis, the Antediluvian World by Ignatius Donnelly. This was from New York, Harper & Brothers, Franklin Square in 1882. That Atlantis was the region where man first rose from a state of barbarism to civilization. And if you've seen my corn videos, if you haven't, I invite you to go watch them. You know, we see that agriculture helped the first civilizations begin. Agriculture, and it was corn. That's how we can trace corn way back 10,000 years. Also, point 4, he says that it became in the course of ages a populous and mighty nation, from whose overflowing the shores of the Gulf of Mexico, the Mississippi River, the Amazon, the Pacific coast of South America, all the way to the Pacific coast of South America. And what's there? Peru, right? The Mediterranean, the west coast of Europe and Africa, the Baltic, the Black Sea, and the Caspian were populated by civilized nations. That the gods, the goddesses of the ancient Greeks, the Phoenicians, the Hindus, and the Scandinavians were simply the kings, queens, and heroes of Atlantis. Alright, hijacked from the indigenous people of America. All these gods, right, they talk about. Where did they originate? And the acts attributed to them in mythology are confused recollection of real historical events. That the mythology of Egypt and Peru represent the original religion of Atlantis, which was sun worship according to them, right? And there was sun worship by some of the tribes that were in America. But we also know that eventually Jehoshua and King David drove some of these sun-worshipping tribes out of Jerusalem and Hebron and all these places in the Bible. So yes, it is correlating with what we've read in the Torah. Point 8, that the oldest colony formed by the Atlanteans was probably in Egypt, whose civilization was a reproduction of that of the Atlantic island. So it says that from America, Atlantis, right? They went over to Egypt that we know today and colonized it there, and that's a colony of Atlantis, not the Egypt. All right, not the original Egypt. That the implements of the Bronze Age of Europe were derived from Atlantis. And if you know about the Michigan mines, you'll see that a lot of the Bronze Age metal that the Greeks and Romans used was coming from America, being mined up there. You can research that. Right? And it continues, says the Atlanteans were also the first manufacturers of iron. Point 10, that the Phoenician alphabet, parent of all European alphabets, was derived from an Atlantis alphabet, which was also conveyed from Atlantis to the Mayas of Central America. Those parts of America over which it ruled were, as we will show thereafter, Central America, Peru, and the valley of the Mississippi, occupied by the mound builders. All right. Moreover, he tells us that this vast power was gathered into one. That is to say, from Egypt to Peru, it was one consolidated empire. We will see hereafter that the legends of the Hindus as the Diva Nahusha distinctly refer to this vast empire which covered the whole of the known world. Alright, so you just heard from this popular Masonic book. This is what they teach themselves. What
have temples on top of its summits. They could not go and break through the boat on the temples atop those great pyramids. There are none there. And that was the clue that Egypt was writing about the Americas. And the deeper I got into the records, the clearer it got. They started actually saying, and because Amun loved that land so much, he said it's his beloved land, and that word was Mary, the beloved, Mary, M-E-R-I, Mary. And the land, of course, as before, is Ta. So you have the land, the beloved land, Ta Mary. And they kept that name and just put the Ta on the end of it. So Ta Mary became a Mary Ta. We simply say America. We kept the name that Egypt gave to the Americas. So that was the big mystery behind that $10 million map that Martin Waldseemüller made and then put the name America on it in 1507. And then those who knew and those who were trying to hide things said, wait a minute, you can't put that name on here. And the next time he reprinted that map, it was off. It was gone. Because that's the name that Egypt had given the land, Tamari. That's where America came from. So now I have Egypt writing about the Americas, but they go further. They don't just talk about we named the Americas. They said where it was. They said our founders, Amun them, Osiris, Isis, all of these. Of course, they use those other names, you know, the Asa and the Aset. And so they said they are in the West. And all over the monuments, they talked about Osiris and said he is foremost of the Westerners, which means not in the front of. He was the most worshipped throughout in the West. And not just his dead spirit, they were talking about the man himself being in the West. So now I have those records. And the deeper I got, the clearer it became.
And you deal with it.
They can't stop us. No matter what they do, they can't stop us. Lex. They can't stop us. Lex. Nah. They can't stop us. Yeah. We ain't build no slave ship. We ain't make those anchors. We ain't
plot those grave sites up since daylight. Burdened by the things we try to make right. It's gonna be a late night. So much turmoil makes my blood boil. Kundalini, encore. Earth is sunbroad, dirt is unsoiled. With one chord, tell a story that some spoil. Watch it unfold, stories untold. Copyright unsold, books with one spine. Ghosts with one soul. They want control, you want control. But we share one goal. Fight one foe, Satchel front door, and it keeps knocking, but the people kept rocking, yeah. It keeps knocking, but the people kept rocking, yeah.